We are leading the way in the greatest human advancement of all time.
While a lot of you are probably sitting at home, trying to avoid coming into contact with pretty much any other human beings, some of us have instead been risking it by going out to see some movies. Maybe not the smartest move, but you know, it's what we do. And there is at least one film out there meant to reward us comic fans who braved the outside world to catch a flick. I am, of course, talking about Bloodshot, the latest action movie to feature Vin Diesel growling through the script and flexing in tight tank tops. Seriously, it's basically its own genre at this point. And if you are one of these people who got out and saw it, the sheer bulk of Diesel's biceps and gravely-ness of his voice might have distracted you from a handful of different Easter eggs and details that the film had to offer. Luckily for you, I'm here to let you all know about the little things that you might have missed. So obviously this video is going to feature spoilers for Bloodshot. So if you care to see the movie first, you might want to do that, then come back to finish this video. Just don't forget your hand sanitizer. For the rest of you, kick back as I regale you with plenty of awesome little details that you more than likely didn't pick up on, or just straight up didn't know about. Let's dive right into it.
Oh man, it is him. Come on, come on, come on.
Let's start this off by talking about the comic origins of the character, which will probably be pretty nice for all of you, since I'm willing to bet that a lot of people who check out this movie aren't even aware that it is based off a comic book in the first place. They didn't exactly advertise it as such. Bloodshot is actually based upon a comic from Valiant Comics, one of the smaller companies in the industry, at least smaller when compared to the juggernauts that are Marvel and DC. The character of Bloodshot first appeared back in Eternal Warrior number 4, before eventually making his way into his own solo comic. Bloodshot was originally a man named Angelo Mortali, who was a hired goon for a mafia crime family. He actually made the mistake of getting a bit too close to the Don's daughter, which ultimately got him taken out. He was later resurrected by a shady organization, which is how he ultimately became the superhero Bloodshot. And I put superhero in some pretty heavy air quotes. Now, wait a minute. That sounds quite a bit different from what we got on the big screen. Not even the name of the character is the same. So what gives? Well, later on, the character saw a sort of pseudo-reboot, introducing him as Raymond Garrison, a former soldier granted superhuman abilities via nanites. What came before wasn't completely thrown out, however, as it was merely explained that his time as Angelo was merely an undercover operation that he undertook, so not a complete change of character. No situation like we've seen in DC and Marvel, where for instance there are like 10 kajillion people who go by the name The Flash. And I think we have like 67,000 Green Lanterns or some crazy number like that. We have at least 4 Batman. Comics are weird, guys. Let's stick with the comic side of things for a second and talk about the handful of comic-related references that the film included. Little Easter eggs that you might not have caught if you aren't a Valiant Comics fan. Let's start things off with Martin Axe, the first target that Ray goes after. At least the first one that we see him go after, as we learn a little bit later on in the movie. Axe is actually a character from the Valiant Comics universe who has existed longer than Bloodshot himself, having first appeared back in 1992. His comic counterpart, though, is not a former RST employee as he is in the film. He was actually a Psyot, a human who had developed psychic powers. In Axe's case, he could communicate with machines, which was rather helpful, since he was obsessed with getting his hands on as much advanced technology as possible. In fact, that's why he committed the pretty blatant acts of villainy that he did in the comics. He's really not a nice guy. And quite a bit different from the sort of whiny, seemingly innocent character that we saw on the big screen. Oh, and also, his name wasn't Martin, it was Buford. Despite being such an important part of the film's overall plot, Gina Garrison doesn't exactly get the most screen time in the final movie. She only really appears during the beginning sequence of the film, where we see her getting taken out by her captors. And then a little bit in the middle, where we learn that she is actually alive, but that she hasn't seen Ray in about 5 years or so. Oh, and she's remarried and has a couple of little kids. What a twist. However, despite her shorter on-screen time, she actually serves as a nice little reference to the Bloodshot comics. See, in the comics there's a character named Gina DiCarlo, the Don's daughter that we mentioned during the section talking about the comics just a little bit ago. Whereas in the film she is alive and well, in the comics, not so much though. In an effort to cover up Bloodshot's past to better control him, the organization started brainwashing everyone who knew him in order to get them to forget about it. When this brainwashing didn't quite take with Gina, they decided that it was easier to just take her out entirely than deal with her in a less violent way. So, all things considered, I guess the film version got the better end of the stick on this one. If you've been paying attention to many of the shots from the comics that I've been showing in this video, you might have noticed the very obvious red circle that the comic version of Bloodshot has on his chest. This is actually a scar. See, when the character got injected with all of the nanites by the organization that brought him back to life, all of the needles that were grouped together in a super tight cluster left behind a giant red scar on his chest. While in the film we did see this process, complete with the giant bunch of needles penetrating his sternum, it didn't leave behind the red scar that we see in the comics. However, the movie did pay homage to this red circle. Whenever Ray and his nanites were beginning to generate a lot of heat in combat, we could see a bit of red coloration that began to emanate from his chest, around the area where the nanites were injected into him. As a bonus, when he got really heated at the end of the film, his skin became really pale as well. Yet another visual nod to how the character looks in the comics. Speaking of the time when Ray was getting injected with millions upon billions of tiny little microprocessors, there is one moment when the film gives us a bit of subtle hinting at the insidious nature of RST. Which is actually pretty refreshing since the movie isn't really subtle about anything. Heck, it literally tells you the entire plot in the trailer. Subtlety is not exactly one of Bloodshot's qualities. Right before Dalton reveals the entire major twist of the film to Ray after plugging him into the machine, we see Dalton remove a bit of gum from his mouth and place it on a lip underneath the table. If you look real quick, you'll see that there are actually a handful of other bits of gum stuck under there, hinting at the fact that this was not the first time that Dalton had done this, which we actually learned to be the case literally less than a minute later. So while this is a nice bit of subtle foreshadowing, it might as well be ignored as the whole thing it was hinting at was revealed so soon afterwards. Really cool idea visually, but horribly executed overall. Alright, nitpicks aside, let's get around to talking about the RST Corporation and its comic counterpart, because that's kind of what we've been doing for a little bit here. In the film, Ray is put back together and controlled by an organization known as RST, which differs a bit from what we saw in the comics. See, in the comics, the group that brought Ray back goes by a couple of different names, including Project Lazarus and Project Rising Spirit, though the latter is easily the most commonly used name. In more recent versions of the character, Project Rising Spirit is a contractor working closely with the US military, and also a part of a sort of super secret society known as the Sect, an organization made up of basically every single other secret society in existence. That's a tad bit different from the company that we see in the film, as that company isn't really expanded upon beyond being something that builds prosthetics and such for wounded soldiers, and that is controlled by a homicidal maniac who will do anything to take out his competition, including potentially ending the lives of his own employees. Sounds like a real charming guy. Now let's talk for a bit here about part of RST's business and how close to reality it actually is. While we aren't really getting close to bringing Spec Ops soldiers back from the dead, enhanced by nanotechnology that boosts them to superhuman levels, some of the other stuff that we see them doing in the film is not completely science fiction. Dalton's leg prosthetics, for example, aren't exactly too far off from what we have today for amputees, including those that lose their legs in war. And sometimes the quality of these prosthetics have even led some to question if they are boosting people beyond their capabilities before they lost their limbs. I mean, look at the situation surrounding the runner Oscar Pistorius. There was a lot of controversy surrounding the types of leg prosthetics that he used while competing, which were believed to be granting him an unfair advantage in competition. And a year-long study found that this was indeed the case, as Oscar was able to swing his legs 15% faster than other world record holders, which is impressive. Now let's try to forget about Pistorius, considering what he did off the track. If you don't know what that is, Google it. It'll probably be the top search result. Now getting back to the film, look at the exoskeleton that Dalton wears during the climax of the movie. This is pretty similar to some of the exosuit tech that the US military has been working on for years, including Lockheed Martin's Onyx, an exoskeleton project designed to aid soldiers in the field in lifting extreme weights, and to help with movement across long distances without tiring the soldier out. So maybe at some point we'll see something like we see in the film on the battlefield. And heck, in the way future, maybe even something like the Mjolnir-powered armor from Halo could be a possibility. Let's just hope that another video game future, like what we see in the Deus Ex franchise, isn't the way that things will go. All that tech in a person, however, would of course cause some issues if they came into contact with any strong electromagnetic fields, such as we see happen in the movie. At one point, Barris's people reveal that they have in their possession a very powerful electromagnetic pulse weapon that was meant to shut down Ray if he ever came a-knockin'. EMPs aren't just something that you see in movies, though they aren't as easily weaponized as they appear in such films, which is a good thing, since they are not something to be taken lightly. If an EMP were to go off, it could permanently destabilize world governments. Basically, if an EMP were to target something like a power grid, it could lead to some pretty horrible stuff. Peter Pry, director of the congressional commission called the EMP Task Force, estimated that about 9 out of every 10 American citizens could die from starvation, disease, or other consequences of societal collapse if an EMP-induced blackout lasted for longer than a year, which would likely be the case if such an event were to take place. In fact, Pry states that using an electromagnetic pulse would be the quickest way to completely cripple the entire United States. And that's some pretty heavy consequences for a device that a lot of movies play off as a cool little gadget to use. Hence why the US government has begun carting in equipment into some of their bunkers in order to protect essential systems from electromagnetic fields. While it's not super likely to ever happen, it is something that the government seems to be trying to prepare for. Now let's get away from all that heavy stuff and get back into the traditional Easter eggs and references, also known as the more fun stuff. You know what the basic plot of Bloodshot reminds me of, personally? The 2000 psychological thriller by Christopher Nolan, Memento. Okay, now just bear with me here for a second. Bloodshot is the story of a man without memories who is manipulated into taking people out who were framed for the loss of his wife. That sounds extremely similar to the plot of Memento. The only real major difference is the fact that the plot isn't shown to us backwards. Although we are kinda dropped into the middle of it there, with Ray having already taken out a handful of people before he starts to catch on as to what is happening. And the connection between these two films is pretty appropriate, especially since the star of Memento, Guy Pearce, is a major player in Bloodshot, taking on the role of Emil Harding, also known as the bad guy. Also, Bloodshot's director Dave Wilson has stated in interviews and such that Memento was a pretty major influence on the movie, so that's pretty awesome overall. Also, check out Memento, that movie's great. Now let's wrap this video up by talking about the smallest, easiest to miss little reference in Bloodshot. A single line that most of you either didn't catch or didn't know what it was referencing. It is a fairly random reference, all things considered. When Wilfred Wiggins brings Ray back to life, he is rather quickly asked exactly who he is, to which he fairly sarcastically responds with, "I am the Crown Prince of Zamunda." As I said, it's a fairly random line, but if you are a fan of 1980s comedies, you probably know exactly what it is referencing. Zamunda is the fictional country from the 1988 Eddie Murphy-led comedy Coming to America. In that film, Murphy plays Akeem, the aforementioned Crown Prince of Zamunda, who travels to America in order to try to find a woman who could fall in love with him for who he is as a person, and not what his royal title would mean for them. So he and a friend, Semi, played by Arsenio Hall, pose as exchange students and take on low-paying, menial jobs to appear like normal schlubs. It's a bit of a classic premise, that was executed in a truly humorous way. So why did the filmmakers have Wilfred make this seemingly random reference? Well, I'm not quite sure there. Could potentially have something to do with the fact that he is meant to serve as the film's comedic relief. So connecting him with a classic comedy could subtly build that idea up in our minds. That could be the case, or maybe the filmmakers just really liked Coming to America and wanted to show it some love in their movie. That is probably a more likely scenario. And that is all of the little details that we managed to catch in Bloodshot. What do you think of human augmentation? Bit of a heavy question, but let's go with it. Let us know down in the comments below. And while you're down there, why not consider subscribing to ScreenRant for more awesome videos just like this. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you at the movies.